Jack sat slouched in the chair across from me, his shoulders hunched, eyes constantly flicking toward the camera mounted in the corner. His fingers, pale and trembling, kept tugging at the frayed cuffs of his prison jumpsuit. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, worn down by something much deeper than exhaustion. It was fear, and something else. I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm and controlled. "You said it started with a crack." Jack nodded slowly, barely meeting my gaze. "Yeah," he mumbled, "just a crack in the wall. That's how it all began." He paused, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment I thought he wasn't going to say anything else. Then he took a shaky breath, his eyes distant, like he was trying to relive those first few days in his mind. "Solitary's always been a mess," he continued, voice hoarse. "The walls in there, cracked, dirty, you get used to it. It's like the whole place is rotting from the inside out. You stop noticing after a while. Mold in the corners, cracks everywhere. Normal stuff for a place like that." His fingers drummed absently on the table, the sound sharp in the otherwise quiet room. I noticed the crack in my cell a few days before everything started. It was small, maybe 3 or 4 inches, right down by the corner where the wall meets the floor. Nothing unusual, right? These walls were falling apart all over the place, so I didn't pay much attention at first. He looked up, his brow furrowed as if trying to decide how to explain what happened next. But the next day, it wasn't just a crack anymore. There was something growing out of it. Black stuff. I thought it was mold. That's what you'd think, right? This place isn't exactly sanitary. Jack took a deep breath, his fingers tapping faster now, more erratic. It didn't move, at least not that I could see. But every time I looked at it, it seemed like there was more of it. I swear to God, it was spreading. Slow, maybe 6 inches a day. I couldn't see it move, but when I'd wake up in the morning, it had crept further along the wall like it was crawling while I was sleeping. I wrote down the details and looked back up. "You're saying it was growing that fast, just overnight?" Jack nodded, his voice growing more agitated. "Yeah, I'd wake up and there'd be more of it. Not much at first, just a few more inches, but I could tell it was moving. The crack was getting wider too, and it wasn't just mold. I knew it wasn't mold, not with the way it looked. It wasn't just sitting there on the surface, it was alive." His voice grew quieter, as though he wasn't sure if he should be saying the words out loud. "It was like it was breathing." I raised my eyebrow but kept my expression neutral. "What made you think that?" Jack shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the walls of the room before fixing on the table. "It wasn't just that it was spreading, it was how it made the room feel. Different, like the air was heavier. It smelled wrong too, not like the usual mold or dampness. This was something else. It smelled like something rotting, foul, the kind of smell that makes you gag." He paused, rubbing his fingers against his temples, trying to recall every detail. "I told the guards the second day right when I noticed it had spread. The guy dropping off food just shrugged it off, said he'd file a report, but I knew he wouldn't. Why would he? It's solitary. They don't care what happens in there as long as we stay quiet." Jack's fingers clenched into fists, knuckles turning white. So I waited. Figured maybe someone would check it out. But no one came, and each morning when I woke up, the black stuff had spread a little more. Not fast enough to notice while it was happening, but enough that I knew it was growing. His voice lowered, his eyes widening slightly as he recounted those days. By the 3rd day, it had covered the entire corner of the wall. The crack had gotten bigger, and the black stuff, it wasn't just growing anymore. It was feeding. It had to be. There was no other explanation for how it was spreading so steadily. Every morning it was a few inches closer, and the smell kept getting worse. He ran his hands through his hair again, his face etched with frustration and fear. I kept telling the guards. Every time they walked by, I'd bang on the door and shout that something was wrong. They thought I was losing it and told me to shut up and deal with it. But I wasn't crazy, that stuff was real and it was spreading. Jack took a deep breath, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. I wasn't imagining it. I know what I saw. The room felt heavier, his words sinking in like stones. He paused, waiting for my response. But I let the silence stretch, giving him time to collect himself. Finally, I asked, what happened after the third day? Did it stop? Jack shook his head, his voice wavering. No, it didn't stop. It just kept growing, slow but steady. Jack took another shaky breath, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. He looked around the room again like he was searching for something that wasn't there, then rubbed his face with both hands. I could tell he was trying to push back the memories, but they kept clawing their way to the surface. It kept spreading, he muttered, his voice strained. Every morning I'd wake up and that black stuff was a little closer. 6 inches, maybe more every damn day. The crack too, it was getting bigger, like something was trying to push its way out from behind the wall. He stopped, staring at the ceiling for a moment, and then shook his head. I couldn't take it anymore. I started banging on the door, yelling at the guards every time they passed. I told them the black stuff was spreading and that the crack was getting worse. They didn't believe me. They just looked at me like I was crazy. His hands clenched into fists. I wasn't crazy, I knew what I saw, but to them I was just another inmate trying to get out of solitary. They told me to calm down and that someone would come check it out, but no one ever did. Not for days. Jack's voice dropped lower. By the 4th day, I could barely breathe in there. The smell. It was like something had died in the walls. Worse than that. It was foul, like the whole room was rotting from the inside out. He stared down at his hands, and I could feel it. In my bones, you know. Like something was wrong with the air itself. It felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I couldn't sleep anymore. I'd lie awake at night staring at that black stuff creeping along the wall, knowing it was getting closer. Jack paused, shaking his head again like he was trying to clear the memory. I begged them. Every time a guard walked by, I begged them to move me, to get me out of that cell. They ignored me. Days passed. The black stuff kept growing. I could feel it getting closer, but they didn't care. He let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow. It wasn't until the lawsuit threats started flying that they decided to move me. They couldn't risk me going to a lawyer saying they were keeping me in a contaminated cell. So they moved me. I watched him carefully. Where did they take you? To another cell in solitary, Jack muttered. A dirtier one, if you can believe that. No black stuff, though. But I could still see my old cell from the window in my door, just a few doors down. I'd look at it every day, but I couldn't see the fungus. Not yet. His voice dropped, barely a whisper now. I wasn't the only one in solitary anymore. They put someone else in my old cell. Jack stared at the table, his face tight with anxiety. At first, I didn't hear much about him. The guards didn't talk to me after I was moved. But after a few days, I started to overhear things. Little bits and pieces. They said the guy they put in my old cell, he'd touched the black stuff. They had to move him to the med wing. He stopped, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. I didn't know what had happened to him at first, just that he was unconscious and they didn't think he'd wake up. Then the rumors started. Jack's eyes darkened, his voice lowering. They said his skin was changing. One of the guards, said it looked like it was blistering, like something was eating him from the inside out. Another said his veins were turning black, like the stuff was crawling under his skin. I scribbled down notes, glancing up at Jack. "How long after they moved you did this happen?" He shrugged, his voice distant. "A couple of days, maybe. Not long. Whatever was in that cell, it got him fast." Jack's hand shook slightly as he continued. "I started hearing more after that. The guards didn't want to talk about it, but I could tell they were scared. They were trying to keep it quiet, but everyone knew something was wrong. The guy they put in my old cell, he wasn't just sick, he was changing." Jack shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as if the memory of what came next still gnawed at him. "It wasn't long after that when things started changing. I could feel it. Something was happening in that place. The guards, they stopped talking, just did their rounds without saying a word. No more gossip, no more jokes, nothing." He paused, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "The guy in the med wing, they said he wasn't getting better. They'd quarantined him and locked the whole wing down. That's when they started wearing those suits. You know, the ones they wear when there's a biohazard. Full suits, gloves, masks. I couldn't even see their faces anymore." Jack's voice grew more agitated. "When they came to drop off my meals, they wouldn't look at me. Just shoved the tray through the slot and walked away. I tried asking them what was going on, but they didn't answer. They didn't say a damn thing. It was like I didn't exist anymore." I watched him carefully, jotting down notes as he spoke. "Did you see anything unusual from your cell during this time?" Jack nodded slowly, his eyes flicking up toward the small window in the door. "Yeah, I started watching my old cell more closely. I couldn't see the black stuff at first, not from where I was, but after a few days, I saw it." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The fungus. It was spreading, creeping along the walls of my old cell. I could see it through the window. It had covered almost the whole corner by then, and the crack. It was bigger, a lot bigger. I couldn't see it move, but every day it was a little further along, a little darker, like it was eating away at the walls." Jack swallowed hard, rubbing his hands together again. "And the smell. Even from where I was, I could smell it. Like rot, like something festering. It made my stomach turn every time I caught a whiff of it." He shook his head slowly, his voice growing more desperate. "I kept banging on the door, shouting at the guards, asking what the hell was going on. They wouldn't tell me anything, just dropped off the meals and left. No one spoke to me anymore. It was like the whole place had gone silent." Jack's eyes met mine, wide with fear. That's when I knew. Whatever was happening in that prison, it wasn't just some sickness, it was something else. Something worse. Jack's voice wavered as he continued, the fear evident in every word. "A couple more days passed, and that's when the real shit hit the fan. They stopped delivering meals on time. One day, nothing. No food, no guards, just silence. And I knew something had happened. I could feel it in the air." He rubbed his arms as if trying to shake off a chill. I kept looking out my window, trying to see anything. But the hall was empty. No one came by, no sounds, nothing. It was like I'd been forgotten. Jack paused, his voice trembling slightly. And then I heard the screaming. His eyes grew wide as he relived the moment. It wasn't loud. Solitaries far enough from the main wings that you don't hear much. But I heard it. Faint, like it was coming from down the hall, near the med wing. Someone was shouting, panicked, like they were fighting something. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't good. Jack's breath hitched, and he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. That's when I saw them. The guards. They were running. I've never seen them run before, not like that. They were trying to get out of the med wing, but something was wrong. One of them looked terrified, and I could hear them shouting at each other. Then, silence. He stared at the table, eyes wide and unblinking. That's when I heard the footsteps. Jack's breath quickened as he continued. They were heavy, dragging like something was limping down the hall. I rushed to the window trying to see what it was, but the hall was still empty. The sound grew louder and closer, and I swear it was coming from the direction of the med wing. Whatever was making those footsteps, it wasn't walking like a person. He paused. I heard the guards again. They were shouting something about getting the doors open. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew they were scared, and that scared me. Jack looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. I saw one of them, a guard, running down the hall. He was heading toward my cell, fumbling with the keys, trying to unlock the door. He kept looking back like something was chasing him. He swallowed hard, his voice shaking. I didn't see it at first, but I heard it. This wet, squelching sound like something dragging across the floor. And then I saw it. The thing they'd put in the med wing. It wasn't human anymore, it was changed. Jack's hands shook as he spoke, and I could see the fear in his eyes, the memory of that moment burning like a fresh wound. I couldn't move. I just stood there staring at it. The thing, it wasn't human anymore. I don't even know if it remembered being human. His voice cracked, his breath uneven. It was big, taller than I remembered the prisoner being, like it had been stretched somehow. Its skin, if you could even call it that anymore, was swollen, bulging in places like it was filled with something. The black fungus had grown over most of its body, but it wasn't just on the surface. You could see it moving underneath, crawling through its veins, thick and dark. Its skin was splitting in places, oozing this thick black liquid. Parts of it looked like they were rotting, but it was still alive. Jack leaned forward, his voice dropping as he described the creature in horrifying detail. The worst part was its face. The fungus had taken over most of it, but I could still see parts of what used to be a man. His mouth was hanging open, slack like it had forgotten how to close. His eyes. God, his eyes. They were completely black, not just the pupils, but the whole thing, like they had been swallowed by the darkness inside him. Jack's hands gripped the table, his knuckles white. It wasn't just the way it looked. It moved wrong too, like its bones had been broken and put back together in the wrong order. Its arms were too long, its legs bent in ways that didn't make sense. It didn't walk so much as lurch, dragging one foot behind the other. Every step it took made this wet, squelching sound like the fungus was eating away at it from the inside out. He paused, staring at the floor, his voice growing weaker. It smelled too, like rot, like meat left out too long. The air around it was thick with the stench and I could barely breathe. I don't know how the guard could stand being that close. Jack swallowed hard, eyes wide. He almost had the door open. I was right there watching through the window and I could see him fumbling with the keys, trying to get the lock undone. His hands were shaking so bad I thought he'd drop the keys. His voice trembled as he continued. He was muttering to himself, saying something about needing to get me out. I don't even think he saw the thing coming for him until it was too late. Jack squeezed his eyes shut as if trying to block out the memory. The door clicked open. He finally got it. I thought for a second I was going to make it, but that thing, it was right behind him. It grabbed him before he even had a chance to run. Jack's voice faltered, barely above a whisper. I've never seen anything like it. The way it grabbed him like it didn't even care, it just tore into him. Its hands, if you can even call them that, were these twisted claws, black and dripping with whatever the fungus had turned it into. It sank them into his chest like they were cutting through butter. He shook his head, eyes distant. He didn't scream, not even once. 1 second he was there and the next. He wasn't. Just blood, everywhere. The thing was ripping him apart, tearing chunks out of him like it was feeding. And I just stood there watching, too scared to move. Jack took a deep breath, his voice still shaking. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like forever. But after it was done, it didn't even look at me. It just turned and started dragging his body down the hall. Like it didn't have any purpose, like it was just following some mindless instinct. His hands were still trembling. Jack lifted his head slightly and his voice was growing faint. And then, it left. Jack's breathing was shaky as he continued, his hands still trembling slightly from the memory. I thought it was over. I thought once it killed the guard, I'd be next. But it didn't even look at me. It just dragged the body down the hall. His voice wavered, growing more desperate as he relived the moment. The fungus, it had spread. I hadn't noticed it before, not like that. I could see it now seeping out from under the door of my old cell, black tendrils creeping into the hallway. It had gotten bigger, much bigger. Thick, dark strands covered the walls near the cell, growing into the cracks, spreading further and faster than I'd ever seen. Jack swallowed hard, his voice shaking. The thing, it dragged the guard's body right up to the spot where the fungus was leaking out into the hall. I thought maybe it was going to leave him there, but no, it did something worse. He looked down at the table as if ashamed of what he'd seen. It shoved the guard's body into the fungus, just pushed him right into it like the wall wasn't even there anymore. The black stuff, those tendrils, they wrapped around him, pulling him deeper like it was absorbing him. Jack's voice grew quieter, his fear palpable. I could see it. The fungus spread over the guard's body, crawling over his skin and covering him like a web. His face, what was left of it, disappeared into the black mass and then the wall. The wall seemed to eat him. It pulled him in until all I could see was this black mound stuck to the wall like it was holding him there. He stared at the floor, eyes wide. It was like the fungus had claimed him, like it was feeding off of him. The more it wrapped around him, the bigger it got, spreading faster now, reaching further along the hallway. Jack paused, his breath catching in his throat. And then the thing that killed him, it started eating. His voice faltered, his eyes wide with terror. It crouched down right by the spot where the fungus was growing the thickest, and then it started tearing chunks of it off, big wet chunks of black mold, and shoving it into its mouth. It was like it was starving for it, like it needed the fungus to survive. Jack's body shook, his hands clenching into fists. I couldn't watch. It was eating the fungus like it was meat, like it was devouring something alive. And the more it ate, the more the fungus seemed to spread. I could see the walls pulsing like they were alive, like the whole damn place was breathing. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was still the prisoner or something else entirely. But whatever it wasn't human anymore. It was part of the fungus, part of whatever was growing inside the walls. Jack's breath hitched, his eyes wide. I was too scared to move. I just watched as it fed. Jack's voice was quieter now, but there was a tension in every word. I don't know how long I stood there watching it eat. I was too scared to move, too scared to breathe. I thought if I made a sound it would turn around and I'd be next. He swallowed hard, staring at the table as if seeing that moment again. But eventually, It stopped. The thing just stood up slow, like it had all the time in the world. I thought for sure it would notice me then, but it didn't. It just turned, shuffling down the hall back toward the med wing. The fungus was still spreading behind it, creeping further down the walls. Jack took a shaky breath, his hands clenching and unclenching as he continued. That was my chance. The door was unlocked. I didn't want to go out there, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cell. Not with that thing out there. Not with the fungus spreading. He paused, his eyes wide, still rattled by the memory. So I opened the door. As quietly as I could, I slipped out into the hallway. The place smelled worse than ever, like the air itself was rotting. The walls, they were breathing, pulsing with the black fungus. It had spread further since the last time I looked, covering the doors, the cracks creeping along the floor. His voice wavered, fear threading through his words. I didn't know where to go. The hall was empty, no guards, no prisoners, just me. I thought about heading back to the main wings, but I didn't know if anyone else was still alive. I didn't know if the fungus had spread to the rest of the prison. Jack rubbed his temples, trying to push back the panic that still clung to his voice. The sound, I couldn't get it out of my head. The walls were making this wet, squelching noise. Every time the fungus pulsed, it sounded like something living was inside the walls, moving with it. Like the prison itself was infected. He looked up at me, eyes wide with fear. I kept moving, but it was slow. I was terrified of making too much noise. I didn't know if that thing was still out there, and I wasn't going to take any chances. I stuck close to the walls, avoiding the patches of black mold that were creeping up from the cracks in the floor. The whole place felt wrong. It felt alive. His hands trembled as he spoke, the fear in his voice growing. I made my way through the hallway past the other cells. Some of them were still locked. I could hear things inside, but I didn't stop to listen. I couldn't afford to. I just kept going, trying to get as far away from that thing as I could. Jack swallowed hard. I don't know how long I walked before I reached the door to the main wing. I thought maybe I'd find someone. Another guard, maybe. But the door, it was locked. No way out. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting to the camera in the corner of the room. I was trapped. He rubbed his hands over his face, his voice trembling. That's when I heard it. The creature, the thing that killed the guard. It was coming back. I could hear its footsteps, that slow, wet shuffle dragging something along the floor. I knew it was coming for me this time. His hands clenched the edge of the table. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I looked around trying to find somewhere to hide, but there was nothing. The fungus was everywhere, crawling along the floor, the walls. I could hear it pulsing. I thought I could feel it inside my head, beating like a second heartbeat. Jack swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. And then I saw it. An air vent just above the door. It was small, barely big enough for me to squeeze through, but it was my only option. I climbed up, using the edge of the door for leverage, and pulled the grate off the vent. It wasn't quiet, but the creature, it didn't seem to care. It just kept coming. He took a shaky breath. I shoved myself inside the vent, trying not to make too much noise. I could hear it below me, dragging itself closer. I could feel the heat from its body, the smell of rot filling the air. I didn't dare look down. I just kept crawling inch by inch through that narrow space, praying it wouldn't hear me. Jack rubbed his hands together, the tension clear in his body. I don't know how long I crawled through those vents. It felt like forever. I could hear the fungus growing inside the walls, like it was alive, spreading through the ducts. But eventually I found another opening. He looked up, his eyes wide. I didn't know where I was anymore. The prison was like a maze, but I knew I had to get out. I climbed out of the vent and dropped down into another hallway. This one was quieter and cleaner. I could hear voices in the distance. Someone was talking. It wasn't a guard. It sounded official. Jack's fingers trembled slightly. That's when I saw them, federal agents. They were wearing protective suits, walking through the hallway and talking into radios. I tried to call out to them, but my voice was barely a whisper. I was weak, starving, and my body felt like it was shutting down. He rubbed his face, his voice quieter now. One of them saw me, they turned and pointed, and the others came running. They grabbed me, lifted me up, and I blacked out after that. When I woke up, I was here. The room was quiet for a moment as Jack finished his story. He stared down at his hands, pale and trembling, the words hanging in the air like a thick fog. I watched him carefully, my mind turning over the details of what he'd said. The transformed prisoner, the fungus, the guards. It all lined up with the reports, but something felt off. I glanced at my notes, then back at Jack. You said the fungus was in the walls, that it was everywhere. Do you think it spread beyond the prison? Jack hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. I don't know, it was moving fast. If it's still there, it's probably spread even further by now. I tapped my pen against the table, considering my next question. What about you? Did you come into contact with the fungus? Jack's eyes flickered toward the camera in the corner of the room, his expression tightening. No, he said quickly. I stayed away from it. I made sure. I watched him closely, noting the tension in his voice. You're sure? No spores, no mold on your skin. Jack's hands clenched into fists, his voice dropping. I said I didn't touch it. But something was wrong. I could see it now in the way he moved, the way his skin looked under the harsh fluorescent light. There were small, barely noticeable black spots on his hands, like tiny cracks forming just beneath the surface. His fingernails were chipped and discolored, and there was a faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. I leaned forward slightly. Jack, are you feeling all right? He didn't answer at first. He stared down at his hands, his breath growing shallow. His fingers twitched again, and then I saw it. Just the slightest movement. The skin on his knuckles shifted, bulging for a moment like something was crawling underneath. Jack's eyes widened, his breath quickening. No, this isn't happening. I didn't touch it. But the evidence was clear now. His skin was changing, dark veins spreading slowly under the surface. The fungus had gotten to him. I could see the horror in his eyes as the realization hit him. He backed away from the table, his voice trembling. You've got to help me. I can feel it under my skin. It's spreading. I stood up, reaching for the door, but Jack grabbed my arm, his grip weak but desperate. Please, don't let it take me. Don't let me turn into one of them. I pulled away, calling for the other agents. The door swung open and they rushed in, their eyes wide as they saw the black veins creeping up Jack's arms. He collapsed to the floor, shaking, his breath ragged. It's too late, he whispered. It's already inside me. And then as the agents restrained him, I saw the first crack in his skin. The black tendrils were already spreading. After Jack was restrained and taken away, I sat there in silence, my mind racing. His story was almost too terrifying to believe, but the black veins spreading under his skin told me that something far worse than we could have imagined had happened in that prison. The medical team rushed Jack out of the room, and I made my way to the surveillance office. The tapes from the prison security cameras had been pulled, but I knew where I needed to start. The med bay. Jack had mentioned the prisoner who had been quarantined there, the one who had touched the fungus. If I was going to understand what we were dealing with, I needed to see what had happened to him. I sat down in front of the monitor and loaded the medbay footage. The timestamp matched the days Jack had been talking about, right around the time they had moved him to a new cell and put the infected prisoner in his old one. The screen flickered to life, showing the sterile, dimly lit interior of the medbay. At first, the footage seemed ordinary. The prisoner lay on the bed, motionless, connected to machines that were monitoring his vitals. 2 guards stood nearby, occasionally glancing at him but not paying much attention. It all looked normal, until the prisoner's body twitched. I leaned forward, watching closely. The prisoner shifted again, his arms jerking slightly, his head rolling to one side. At first, it looked like he was waking up, but something was wrong. His movements were erratic and unnatural. The guards noticed it too. They stepped closer to the bed, exchanging nervous glances. And then it began. The prisoner's body convulsed, his back arching off the bed as if something inside him was forcing its way out. His skin started to blister, bulging in grotesque patterns as if something was crawling underneath. The guards rushed toward him, shouting for help, but it was too late. I watched in horror as the black veins spread beneath the prisoner's skin, creeping up from his hands, his arms, his neck, everywhere. His face twisted in pain, his mouth opening in a silent scream, but no sound came out. His eyes turned black, completely black, as if the darkness inside him had consumed everything. The guards panicked. One of them backed away while the other tried to restrain the prisoner, but the prisoner was no longer human. His body was contorted, his arms bending at impossible angles, his skin cracking open to reveal the black fungal growth underneath. It spread across his body like wildfire, taking over every inch of him. Then, with a terrifying burst of strength, the prisoner snapped free from his restraints and lunged at the guard closest to him. The camera shook as the scene descended into chaos. The other guard screamed, backing into the corner as the prisoner, now a monstrous creature, ripped into his colleague, tearing him apart with inhuman strength. I paused the footage, my heart pounding. The image on the screen was frozen. The creature mid-attack, its black eyes staring soullessly into the distance as it tore into the guard's chest. The room was a bloodbath and the transformation was complete. Whatever that thing was, it was no longer the man they had brought into the medbay. I hit play again, watching as the creature dragged the lifeless guard's body across the room, tossing it aside like a rag doll. The other guard tried to escape, fumbling with the door, but the creature was faster. It leaped at him, bringing him down in an instant. Blood splattered across the camera lens, obscuring the footage for a moment, and then silence. The creature stood over the bodies, breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling in sharp, unnatural movements. Black fungus covered its skin, growing thicker and darker with each passing second. It lingered there, almost motionless, and then turned slowly toward the camera. I froze. Its black, hollow eyes were locked directly on the lens as if it knew I was watching. I shut off the footage, leaning back in my chair, my breath ragged. Whatever had happened in that prison, it had started here in the medbay. And now it was spreading,